Viewers of the film Titanic likely have some knowledge about the tragic accident. But what do we know about the technical aspects of the collision and the emotional depth of the story? Let's explore together. The Titanic was the largest ship of its era. It was roughly 275 meters in length, as tall as a 25-story building, and weighed approximately 50,000 tons. On April 10, 1912, it embarked from Southampton Port to usher in a new age of civilian maritime travel. With its massive equipment and lavish decoration, this steel giant resembled a floating luxury hotel more than an ordinary steamship. Its modern waterproof walls and advanced water evacuation system led many to believe that the Titanic was unsinkable. However, it would soon become apparent that this belief was a tremendous miscalculation. On the night of April 14, 1912, despite receiving several ice warnings from other ships in the area, the Titanic continued to push forward at full speed in the darkness. In the early hours of the night, the Pride of the White Star Line Company struck an iceberg and was swallowed by the freezing waters of the Atlantic within just a few hours. The collision damaged about a third of the hull, flooding 6 of its 16 waterproof compartments. Of the more than 2,200 people on board, only around 700 survived. The primary reason for this was the Titanic's insufficient number of lifeboats. Moreover, in the chaotic moments following the collision, many lifeboats were launched before they were even half filled. The wreckage of the ship was submerged in a deep sleep at the bottom of the ocean for over 70 years. The site of the wreckage was finally located in 1985, and the secrets of that disastrous night began to slowly surface. Today, we will examine some chilling artifacts retrieved from the legendary Titanic and delve into the heart-wrenching details of the accident. Enjoy the journey. Love letter. In 2019, a letter penned by Richard Geddes, a crew member on the Titanic, to his wife was discovered. A portion of the letter read, "My dearest love, how are you? I suppose you are missing me a little, aren't you? I feel this ship is better than the previous one. It seems quite sturdy. I hope you're well and not worrying about me. If we arrive on time on Wednesday and I find a boat, I'll write from New York with all my love and kisses to my dear wife and children." Unfortunately, the letter would never reach its intended recipient. Embedded within Geddes's personal sentiments were a few details many were unaware of. Apparently, a few days before the Titanic collided with the iceberg, it had narrowly avoided a collision with a ship named New York. The strong propellers of the Titanic had snapped the ropes of the New York, dragging it alarmingly close to the Titanic. Captain Edward Smith swiftly intervened, using the Vulcan tugboat to distance the New York and averted a significant catastrophe. According to Geddes, many people viewed the chaotic incident as a bad omen. Pocket watch. 34-year-old Sinai Cantor embarked on his journey aboard the doomed ship with his wife, Miriam. The young couple set off towards New York, hoping to make a fresh start in life. Sinai had dreams of studying medicine in America, while Miriam aspired to become a dentist. However, while Sinai lost his life in the freezing waters of the Atlantic that fateful night, Miriam survived, having been placed on a lifeboat. In his final hours, Sinai had with him a small telescope, a corkscrew, a notebook, and a pocket watch. His body was recovered from the water 8 days later, but when he was buried, all his personal belongings had disappeared. Thankfully, Miriam managed to retrieve them, including the pocket watch, the following year. Miriam, who later remarried, kept the watch for years as a memento. In recent years, one of the couple's grandchildren auctioned the pocket watch, selling it for $57,500. Violin. You've probably all heard the touching story of the band on the Titanic, but how many of you knew the tale of the violinist continuing to play as the ship sank was true? The 8-member group bravely played on during their final hours in this world, providing some measure of comfort to the many doomed men, women, and children in the icy waters of the ocean. The inevitable end was minutes away, and most passengers were beginning to panic. These musicians did everything they could to calm the passengers and decided to serenade them as the ship slowly sank into the depths. Their music helped soothe the people on board and ease their final moments. However, according to some of the surviving passengers, the presence of the band on the deck gave a false impression that things weren't as bad as they seemed. Consequently, it may have led many to underestimate the situation. thus preventing more from getting into the lifeboats. It is alleged that the last songs the band played were "Nearer My God to Thee" and "Autumn." Many people attested that the musicians continued to play until the very end. In a report sent to the British Musicians Union, it was stated that none of the band members were wearing life jackets. We can hardly imagine how difficult it must have been to continue playing as the ship tilted and the deck became steep. As you might guess, none of them survived the tragic event. The body of the violinist and band leader Wallace Hartley was recovered and brought back to England for burial. The funeral service was filled with tens of thousands of people who wanted to pay their final respects to the brave musician. A small leather bag was retrieved from the shipwreck. In the bag was a violin, identified as belonging to Wallace Henry Hartley. In the violin case, there was a metal tag inscribed with "For Wallace" on the occasion of our engagement, from Maria. The instrument was cleaned and returned to Wallace's former fiancée, Maria Robinson. The violin stayed in Maria's family until it was auctioned off in the early 2000s. In 2013, it was sold for $1.5 million at auction, making it one of the world's most valuable musical instruments. Purchased by a British collector, the violin continues to be one of the most expensive Titanic memorabilia to this day. Ticket. One of the items retrieved from the Titanic was a ticket belonging to a passenger named Marion Meanwell. Ironically, Marion wasn't even supposed to be on the ship. But fate had other plans. The ticket was initially purchased for the Majestic, the Titanic's sister ship. However, a strike by ship workers caused the Majestic's voyage to be postponed, leading the company to offer Marion a journey on the Titanic instead. Tragically, she accepted and lost her life in the disaster. What's even more heartbreaking is that Marion was just one of many passengers who ended up on the Titanic due to the postponement. Shoe. The next artifact might seem like nothing more than a worn-out men's shoe at first glance. However, a sense of melancholy envelops us once we realize what this personal item truly represents. This simple shoe stands as a symbol of countless individuals, many of whom were hoping to start a better life in America, only to have their dreams obliterated by a colossal iceberg. Furthermore, the catastrophic circumstance from which this artifact emerged serves as a stark reminder of the formidable and terrifying power of Mother Nature. Radio telegraph. "Come at once, we have struck an iceberg." Authorities sent this and many other distress messages to all nearby ships using Morse code. It's worth noting that the radio telegraph used on Titanic is still lying at the bottom of the North Atlantic. There has been a long-standing debate about whether this piece of general technical equipment should be retrieved or not. In theory, it could be possible to recover the telegraph with a diving robot deployed to the ship. The main issue is that the robot is likely to encounter the remains of many deceased individuals, potentially disturbing their final resting place. On the other hand, the RMS Titanic Inc., which holds thousands of artifacts from the Titanic, wishes to exhibit the device that helped to broadcast the distress calls of the sinking ship, aiding in the rescue of around 700 people. Since the wreck of the Titanic is preserved as a monument, such retrieval missions have often been obstructed in the past. It remains unclear whether permission will be granted to recover the radio transmitter, which belonged to the Marconi Company. At the time, this device was the most powerful radio technology installed on a ship. So, what was the problem? Why did no one come to the rescue? The issue was that the station was managed by a private company rather than the crew, meaning that priority in the transmitted data was given to the personal messages of wealthier passengers. Therefore, iceberg warnings were either delayed in reaching the bridge or not delivered at all. Additionally, the exact location of the Titanic was uncertain. During the emergency communications with other ships at the time, the ship's location was repeatedly given and corrected. Even the corrected position was miles away from where the wreckage was finally uncovered in 1985. Big Piece. The Big Piece is a 15-ton section of the Titanic's hull recovered from the wreckage in August 1998, and it is the largest piece ever salvaged from the shipwreck. This section, which is about 8.5 meters long, constituted the outer wall of the luxury cabin's bathrooms, as well as the cabins themselves. The holes on it were the windows of the cabins. The big piece was one of many hull walls that got destroyed when the ship broke apart. The wreckage once again shows us that the Titanic ultimately fell victim to the forces of nature. The forces acting on the ship's body during the sinking were so intense that the giant ship, weighing 52,000 tons, could not withstand it and shattered like a matchstick. According to the Titanic's manufacturer, the White Star Line, the ship should have been able to stay afloat for 2 to 3 days, even in the worst possible sea disaster. Angel Statue. An angel statue once adorned the grand staircase of the Titanic, and its fame grew even more after the release of James Cameron's record-breaking movie Titanic. It served as a perfect romantic backdrop character in scenes where Jack and Rose locked eyes on the grand staircase. However, this religious figure holds a much deeper meaning for some people. As the ship's maiden voyage approached, rumors began to circulate that not even God could sink the Titanic. Some religious citizens saw these kinds of claims as disrespectful to sanctity and claimed that God would not let such a thing go unpunished. After the disaster, many people were convinced that the dreadful end of the Titanic was due to this blasphemy. The angel in the movie is often confused with the original statue. The actual angel, which is smaller in size, was salvaged from the wreckage during an exploration trip in 1987. After a lengthy conservation process, it began to be exhibited. Machine telegraph. Titanic's engine telegraph, unlike the radio mentioned earlier, was salvaged in 1987. At that time, such telegraphs were used to convey orders from the bridge to the engine room. It is undisputed that this form of communication played a central role in the collision with the iceberg. However, it remains a subject of debate what orders Titanic officer William Murdoch was giving at that time. In James Cameron's Titanic movie, the officer is seen giving a stop order before the collision. Nevertheless, it seems more likely that the ship slowed down only after hitting the iceberg. The truth is, there is still much unknown about the tragic event. Even those who were aboard the ship on that dreadful evening shared conflicting stories. On the other hand, it is entirely natural that the emerging chaos blurred the judgment and memories of the passengers. Danger Bell. On the night of April 14, 1912, around 11:40, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg looming in front of the ship. Fleet immediately rang the alarm bell and sent a danger report soon after. Decades later, the bell, which heralded the end of Titanic, was brought back to daylight. It is now on display at the Titanic Museum in Belfast. Unlike many other crew members, Frederick Fleet's survival from the accident was not a matter of luck. He owed it to Third Officer Charles Lightoller, who assigned him as the person in charge of lifeboat number 6. After the accident, he was interrogated because he had important information about the incident, but his answers were not satisfying. He could not say how high the lookout tower was, or how far away he was when he saw the iceberg. Fleet didn't even know if it was a minute or an hour between the iceberg being noticed and the accident. To the inquiry board, the lookout simply stated, "I have no idea about dimensions and distances." The only things he remembered were the breathtaking sight of the stars illuminating the night and the unanswered calls after he spotted the iceberg. It is estimated that the engineers were following routine shift duties, such as inspecting the boiler rooms and looking after the main engines. Since everything on the ship was proceeding normally, there was no reason for the on-duty crew in the boiler rooms to suspect anything untoward. When the alarm bell rang to stop the engine and reverse the course, there were no engineers in the engine control room. Therefore, there was a delay in the transmission and implementation of the commands. Sadly, it was already too late. Here is where things get interesting. While movies portray the moment of the accident with various dramas, cowardice, and chaos, the testimonies of real eyewitnesses were quite different. Survivor Dr. Washington Dodge stated in his testimony, "I watched the boats being filled up and lowered one after the other. During this time, there was no panic, no sign of fear or anything unusual. I did not see a woman or a child cry. Even those left on the Titanic after the last lifeboats departed were astonished by what they saw." Charles Lightoller, who was in charge of loading the portside boats, stated in the inquiries about the accident, "We, as the crew, deliberately downplayed the danger to prevent panic. We said the boats were being lowered as a precaution and assured that the rescue ship was just a few kilometers away. Thus, there was no pushing or crowding at the boats. All the men helped women and children with all their might. You couldn't see such silence even in a church. After the accident, White Star Line made changes to many of their existing ships to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. These changes were based on the design flaws that were assumed to have contributed to the disaster. In addition to these design changes, both the British and American governments introduced new safety regulations to White Star Line and all shipbuilding companies of that time. Understanding how tragic the events on Titanic were may be difficult. Empathizing with those on board is getting harder as the years go by. Yet these priceless artifacts have taken us back in time, reminding us not to take ourselves too seriously and to appreciate every moment we live. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for upcoming videos.